We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. Right-wing President Yoon of South Korea declared martial law yesterday. South Koreans are demanding his impeachment. The United States has maintained a close relationship with the South Korean president and plays a dominating role on the Korean peninsula. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Jamie Tyberg. She is an organizer with Nodutdol. Jamie, welcome to the Socialist Program.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining. I mean, huge drama on the Korean peninsula, inside of South Korea in particular. The Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, the KCTU, announced a general strike when this right-wing president declared martial law. I mean, almost immediately was overturned, but the drama, the saga hasn't ended. Let's just bring everyone up to date. What's going on right now? Why did he declare martial law? What was the political purpose of it? And why is it backfired?
Yeah, just to give an overview of the events, he declared martial law at 10:30 p.m. in the evening, Korea time on Tuesday. And he said this will go into effect at 11 p.m. And immediately protests broke out. Under the South Korean constitution, their legislature, the National Assembly, can overturn martial law. Now, predicting this, Yoon tried to stop this by sending soldiers and helicopters to guard the National Assembly. But people immediately surrounded the building in the middle of the night. Members of the National Assembly broke the windows to get past the military barricades. And so around 5 a.m., the lawmakers were able to enter the building and take a vote. And 190 of the 300 members that were present for the vote, which reaches quorum, voted unanimously to lift the martial law. And they asked all the military forces to exit the National Assembly. So in all, the martial law was in effect for only about 6 hours. But people were flabbergasted. I mean, even his conservative base in different cities were shocked by this. His entire presidential cabinet was caught off guard. In fact, his senior presidential staff, so essentially the entire presidential cabinet, including his chief of staff, all of the senior secretaries, they either have now by this point resigned or offered to resign because of this declaration of martial law. The head of his political party, the conservative right-wing People Power Party, immediately rejected the martial law as well. And as you mentioned, the KCTU, the largest progressive umbrella union, called for an indefinite strike until Yoon resigns. They also published a statement saying that the Korean people will not forgive this anti-democratic martial law, that the people remember the fate of the regimes in the past that have declared martial law, and that they remember the end of the regimes that deceived and suppressed citizens. And just to give a sense of the gravity of this, the KCTU's membership is over 1 million workers. And these workers are across several critical sectors. They include truckers, railroad workers, metro workers, education workers, and many more. In American context, if I fit it to the American population, this would be about 7 million workers in America going on strike. And I mean, even before this, his approval rating was already less than 19%. But now people don't just dislike him, they're embarrassed of him. And I think in Korean society and culture, that's a stronger path to downfall. The people that were protesting were chanting, "Abolish martial law, down with dictatorship." And my mom, who's actually a high school history teacher in South Korea, I was on the phone with her yesterday, and she described this as him digging his own grave. And the most recent development is that the opposition party, the Democratic Party, as well as five other minor parties, they plan to bring his impeachment up to a vote as early as this Friday. Now, this motion would require two-thirds majority to pass the parliament and then at least six judges to pass the motion. Um, this will need at least eight votes from the People Power Party, Yoon Suk-yeol's party, to pass the bill. But his party did put out an official statement that they will oppose the impeachment. But this is just the stance of the party, and so individual lawmakers could make their own votes differently. Um, and in the US, Nodutdol is actually organizing rallies across the US today on December 4th in New York and LA and San Francisco. We're taking our cues from the KCTU as well as other progressive organizations who have made it clear that the struggle is not over yet, and that removing Yoon from the office is the goal. So we'll be urging people to call and email the South Korean consulate here in the US in support of these calls for his impeachment.
Well, before the declaration of martial law, there were massive protests against the Yoon government. What prompted those demonstrations? I mean, he said when he was declaring martial law, he said it was to purge the government of pro-North Korean forces. Now, North Korea is a punching bag in South Korea. It's illegal to have relations with North Korea. There's the national security law, very notorious law, whereby people were sentenced to prison for 10 years just for visiting North Korea, for saying something sympathetic, even favoring reunification of the divided peninsula, where after the Korean War, after really World War II, 10 million families had been divided. This was the boogeyman was North Korea. But all of these people were in the streets before martial law. Obviously, they weren't being motivated by the government in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. What were the protests all about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there has been a growing opposition against Yoon, not just in the opposition Liberal Democratic Party, but also in the masses and the popular movement. The unions have been protesting his, anti-labor laws, stagnating wages. Yoon is just not capable of actually resolving the contradictions that capitalism has brought to the country. And more importantly, Yoon has also pardoned Japan, South Korea's former colonizer, and entered into a military alliance with Japan and the United States. This does not serve the interests of the working people in South Korea. One of his main goals in his presidency was for South Korea to become the fourth arms exporter in the world. And instigating these global tensions, in fact, earned Korean as well as Japanese defense contractors a surge in their revenue. And he is really positioning the conglomerate Hanwha Corporation to essentially be South Korea's SpaceX. Hanwha is a defense contractor. They went up 18 spots in the global defense contractor arms revenue ranking in just 1 year, and their stocks went up 350%. And Yoon is really aiding the US by launching South Korea's aerospace industry, because the controlling space is essentially the ultimate high ground advantage in war. And workers at Hanwha Corporation have been protesting, have been dealing with, really terrible working conditions. And in addition to that, there was also the scandal with Yoon's wife for stock manipulation. I mean, there was just a whole host of issues that the people have been really, again, disapproving his presidency of. But to comment on the pro-North Korean forces, um, reasoning and his justification for declaring martial law. I mean, this is something that every South Korean military dictator has used. Whenever Korean people anywhere try to fight for a better society, they're accused of being North Korean agents. If the media criticizes Yoon, he calls them North Korean agents. When the truckers went on strike for better wages, he told them, get back to work before I prosecute you for being North Korean spies. And when peace activists tried to hold movie screenings promoting reconciliation with North Korea, he threw them in jail. So no one, seriously thinks that North Korea has infiltrated the Democratic Party, but because the Democratic Party has a position to oppose all sanctions on North Korea, this line of purging pro-North Korean or pro-state force or anti-state forces is used to attack them. I also want to step back though and think about why this sort of narrative is even possible. It's because the US refuses to end the Korean War or come to the table to resolve the Korean War. And so now we have a situation where there is a 70-plus-year ongoing war that produces this, constant sense of crisis, a deep sense of insecurity and instability. It creates this culture within the people of fear that's deeply indoctrinated within South Korea. And then, furthermore, any aggression towards North Korea is considered legitimate because of the US's propaganda and depiction of it. And so, South Korea is really like unable to make any real progress because anyone or any group that dares to fight for more and a just society is then branded as the enemy that is, colluding with this looming like imminent threat up north.
So, Jamie, that's so important. And I think for people watching this show or listening to this show, they have to sort of put the current drama going on in South Korea into a larger historical context. Because without that, you really don't understand what's going on. And it's not just what's happening now, what happened with the president before this, not the last one, but the one before, also toppled by a mass people's movement. Park Geun-hye, and she herself was the daughter of a South Korean military leader who had been assassinated by others in the South Korean military. The U.S. Military forces still occupy South Korea, tens of thousands of them. The U.S. and South Korea every year carry out war exercises that are the biggest in the world, simulating the invasion and destruction of North Korea. When you go all the way back into history, you see, well, look, the war and the conflict in Korea has to be in the context of the Korean War that has not ended. And that's the point that you were making. The war began June 25th, 1950. That means on June 25th, 2025, it'll be 75 years ago. Every war has a beginning, obviously. But this war, unlike all other wars, hasn't come to an end because the U.S. refuses to sign a peace treaty. It did sign an armistice agreement on July 27, 1953, that ended the military hostilities, but the U.S. won't sign a peace treaty, so the U.S. is still technically at war against the DPRK. That becomes a pretext for endless sort of military threats against North Korea. Anyway, why does the Korean War not come to an end?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that it serves US's interests, particularly in that region of the Indo-Pacific, for the US to have control over the peninsula, or at least the southern part of the peninsula. The Korean War to us is, the US disrupting Korea's process of decolonization. Korea had fought to earn its independence from its former colonizer, Japan. And immediately it started organizing people's committees. They implemented the Korea People's Republic. And just within days of that, the US came in and began to occupy. And what is known as the Korean War, which, if you're taught about it at all, is told began because the North invaded the South, is just not true. Because Koreans can't invade their own country. What the North was actually doing was going to war against the U.S. occupation in the South, as opposed to going to war with their own people in the South. And because Korea was really leaning socialist at the time, the US could not lose that peninsula, which is situated in a very strategic location, sharing borders with China as well as Russia, at the time, the Soviet Union. And so instead of surrendering and allowing North to win, and take claim of what is rightfully their country and what was, hardly earned and fought, to take back from Japan, they draw an arbitrary line. The U.S. draws an arbitrary line, and says, Korea, the peninsula south of this border, is now under our military control. And to this day, that really serves their military as well as economic interests. There's 62 military bases in South Korea, around 30,000 troops in South Korea. The largest US military base outside of North America is actually in South Korea, in the city of Pyeongtaek. And it's really proving to be useful, especially now, as the US ramps up its escalation against China in the new Cold War. Since 2022, the US has deployed nuclear submarines, heavy bombers, aircraft carriers. They hold hundreds of days of military exercises. And this is also why North Korea is, forced to respond with increasing their defenses. But yeah, the U.S. really refuses to resolve or end the war because it's strategic for them, especially now more than ever, to have control and operational wartime control, in fact, over the South Korean army.
Well, there was mass killing going on by South Korean military forces right as the war broke out and right in the days and weeks and months afterwards. I actually visited some of the sites in 2001 where there was a great deal of activism inside of South Korea to expose the fact that there were about 1,200 instances that had been recorded at that time of mass killings, meaning taking political prisoners who were sympathetic to the North. And it wasn't a small group. It was huge. The number of people who were sympathetic to Kim Il-sung, people who were setting up people's committees in the South, it was the majority, perhaps, of the population, or certainly the majority of those people who were politically active. So we're talking about workers, farmers, young people. And there was maybe tens of thousands. There's a New York Times article, I think about 14 years ago, based on the report of, I think it's called the Korea Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they document tens of thousands of South Korean people were just taken to every different here or there place and just massacred. And that was while the U.S. military was really in command of the South Korean military. I mean, by June 28th, 1950, when the UN, so-called UN, the UN was used by the U.S. as a fig leaf for its invasion of, or re-invasion of Korea, those South Korean military officers were under American control. This could not have been happening without U.S. support. You can see why the U.S. would have gone into overdrive later to demonize North Korea punish anyone who said anything about North Korea that was positive, send them to prison where you would invariably be tortured. And some of the people were in prison for decades. I'm talking about 30, 40 years. You can see how you could drum that out of the population that, actually the U.S. was trying to stop the anti-colonial process, and that the North Korean government, unlike the Syngman Rhee government in South Korea, was actually the leadership of the anti-colonial, anti-Japanese movement. So again, if people take a certain snapshot in history, they'll think like, oh, this is how the South Korean people feel. But if you don't understand the historical processes, you can't understand how consciousness is formed and then reformed. Anyway, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the US soldiers supported and oversaw a series of brutal massacres in South Korea in the late 40s and early 50s, as you're saying. They helped the South Korean government repress popular uprisings in numerous cities. And in the early days of the Korean War, South Korean soldiers and police massacred between 100,000 to 200,000 political dissidents, often in plain view of the US and allied soldiers and officers. I think people are really thinking back to the Gwangju uprising this week with the martial law, because that was the last time that the martial law was declared. In fact, during the protests Monday night, people were singing a song, March for Our Beloved, which was written after a martyr during the Gwangju massacre. And during the Gwangju massacre as well, the then military dictator Chun Doo-hwan, he actually called President Jimmy Carter for his permission, who gave him the green light for the South Korean paramilitaries to be deployed from the demilitarized zone, the line that divides North and South, and to be brought to Gwangju to commit the massacre against the people there.
Yeah. And again, people should go look it up. Gwangju Massacre, that's May 18th, 1980. Jimmy Carter is still president of the United States. Thousands of students were, one by one, executed. This is when the U.S. was South Korea was under complete U.S. control. The U.S. control is complete. As a matter of fact, Jamie, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that in the moment of crisis, any crisis, the South Korean military is obligated by treaty, or obviously it's not a real treaty between allies because South Korea is an occupied country by the U.S., South Korean military loses its own sovereignty and its own control over the military forces, and that reverts to a U.S. command. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So the U.S. has operational wartime control over the South Korean military, which has over 3 million troops if you count the reserves. And so they can actually enlist South Korean soldiers for wars outside of Korea. And even liberal presidents in South Korea have done this, where they send South Korean troops for U.S. wars, including the illegal invasion of Iraq.
And South Korean forces were in Vietnam, fighting alongside the U.S. against the Vietnamese people. Here is the irony: is that when the Vietnamese people were trying to overcome French, and then during World War II, Japanese colonial domination of Vietnam, and World War II ended and Japan lost, and the United States and, well, particularly its allies like France and the other European colonial powers were weaker, as was Japan. The people in different countries, including Korea, including Vietnam, all over the place, actually, in India, they thought, okay, our oppressor, our colonizer is in a weakened position. We can become free, independent, self-determining people. We can become our own nation. And when they were engaged in anti-colonial struggle, like the Vietnamese were against the French, the U.S. stepped in after the French lost at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and the U.S. became the war makers against but it's always the colonial struggle. So you have in Vietnam and in Korea, the people want to be free. They want to be independent. They don't want to live under colonialism. And here you have, after World War II, under the banner of anti-communism, the U.S. stepping in basically to deprive the people of their independence. Now, you might say, well, that's the fight against communism. Well, here we are, Jamie, this Cold War is over. The Soviet Union disappeared in 1991. There's no longer the global war against communism, but U.S. troops are still in South Korea.
Yeah, I mean, it's the new Cold War, and the US is really, I think, stretched thin across its several command structures around the globe, which is why it really needs to recruit the military power of, namely Japan and South Korea, Philippines, Thailand, Australia in the region in order to try to contain or compete with China and Russia. I think, unlike other countries in the emerging multipolarity that might have power, what really scares the US about China and Russia is that they're huge countries, both in population as well as in landmass. And China especially is surpassing the US economically. Global South in general is surpassing the global North economically. And China has been playing more of a mediating and facilitating role politically on the world stage. We saw this with Palestine, where the different political parties of Palestine were brought in Beijing to discuss the future of their country. And countries in the Indo-Pacific, in fact, consider China to be a source of collective economic development. And so all of this is extremely dangerous for the US in protecting their interests and position of hegemony. And that's why they're really, putting their claws into South Korea, so that they can make sure they still have access to that region, which again is a very strategic location.
During the Trump administration, Trump went through a couple different sort of twists and turns, not that odd for Donald Trump. But at the beginning, he said, we're gonna crush North Korea, we'll eviscerate it, we'll blow it to bits. He talked about Kim Jong-un in the most disgusting ways, called him names. It was like typical Donald Trump, but, really gross. And then Trump changed. It was clear that the North Koreans were not backing down. Their knees were not shaking. Kim Jong-un was not afraid. The North Koreans had already, after George W. Bush threatened them in 2001 and 2, when Bush declared North Korea was part of the axis of evil with Iran and Iraq and was preparing at that time to invade Iraq, the North Koreans, they were like, okay, the U.S. is going to invade Iraq, and then they're going to invade us, so we're leaving the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and we're getting nuclear weapons. And they did. They built their own nuclear weapons using a lot of indigenous technology, and they became a nuclear power. So here you are in 2017, Kim Jong-un is like saying, okay, well, we don't want war, we want peace, we want a peace treaty, we've always said we want a peace treaty, but you're not going to scare us. And Trump flipped. And then he said, well, let's meet, because the North Koreans had invited him to meet. So there was a summit in Singapore and another summit in Hanoi, in Vietnam, where Trump met with Kim Jong-un, and they actually signed what was called the Singapore Summit Declaration. It was a very interesting declaration. This was in 2019. The first point of the declaration is the United States and the DPRK commit to establish new U.S.-DPRK relations in accordance with the desire of the people of the two countries for peace and prosperity. So that's number one. It wasn't about nuclear weapons. It was like, let's have a new relationship. And then at that time, there was a different South Korean government, a more progressive government than the Yoon government that declared martial law. And that government also signed what's called the Panmunjom Declaration with Kim Jong-un, with the North Koreans. And you see there Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un and Trump at the DMZ, at the demilitarized zone, separating the two. Well, it's one Korea that's been divided into two. At that time, there was kind of a panic inside the U.S. establishment and within the military-industrial complex because it actually looked like peace could break out on the Korean Peninsula, that war that never ends could have an ending. And I was just thinking about it, and I want to get your thoughts about it. One, I mean, there's the obvious things that you already said. The U.S. actually wants to keep the conflict going for its other purposes, like having a pretext to put that many warships and aircraft into the Pacific against China. But there's another element of it, and I want to get your thoughts on this. And I don't know if Nodutdol has also talked about this or written about it. But if the two Koreas, so-called, unified on any basis, and you have South Korea as the, I don't know what it is now, the 10th largest economy in the world. North Korea has been terribly sanctioned, but at one time, North Korea had a bigger economy than South Korea. Now it's under sanctions. If those two countries were together, if Korea was in fact unified, a population it would be a fairly large country, a highly educated country, it would be a powerhouse. I mean, it wouldn't simply be free and independent. You can see Korea emerging as a major force in the Pacific. And if it was under the circumstances of reunification, that would signal that Korea would have had a progressive agenda in relationship to the U.S., meaning wanting to have peace in Asia. I think that people don't think about it that way. Like, what if the two Koreas united? But that would be huge. And I think it would be a major shift in global politics. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you have to consider, reunification by what terms. If it reunifies by absorption, where the South Korean government absorbs the North Korean government, then we would have lost, a socialist state that's currently defending its revolution. And the U.S. would have access to even greater, landmass to turn into their military base, directly sharing the border with China and Russia. But if there is a, more progressive South Korean government that's willing to reunify, perhaps under, a two-government structure, and one that is really championing, reunification and independence through democratic terms without, foreign intervention or, foreign supervision with the U.S., then, yeah, I think the U.S. would be in a really tricky situation where they can no longer control that region or the Korean, country as a military base, and they would really lose their strategic foothold in that region.
Yeah, no, those are important clarifications. Again, if it was reunification the way Germany was unified, where East Germany, the socialist German Democratic Republic, was just basically taken over by the pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist West Germany, a historic setback for the people in East Germany, certainly. But, as you said, if on the contrary, however it was configured, I mean, if South Korea had a socialist revolution, that would be one possibility. And South Korea has got a huge militant proletariat, so it's not impossible at all. Secondly, as you also alluded to, and as China found ways, in the case of Hong Kong, for instance, to say one country, two systems, at least for the short or foreseeable future, meaning China took Hong Kong back from British colonialism, but allowed the Hong Kong economic social order to basically remain intact. There's all kinds of things. And when the DPRK was the entity that initially inaugurated the idea of peaceful reunification back in the early 1970s, which I remember, that's the kind of proposal that the Kim Il-sung government was actually making. It was a little bit vague, a little bit uncertain, but basically let's reunify on a peaceful basis in the issue of the social and economic order. We can work out over time, but at least we'll be free, meaning independent, and part of our country will not be under U.S. occupation. So where there's a will, there's a way. And yes, if there was a counter-revolution or regime change in North Korea, that would be one thing. But I think the DPRK government has made it quite clear, Jamie, that they understand that regime change has been on the U.S. agenda for a long time. They've oriented towards it and to fight it. And I think they've shown such determination and prowess, actually, not just military strength, but diplomatic prowess. I don't think that's likely.
Yeah. And, even with their nuclear development as well, Pyongyang really sees it as a deterrent from hostility and aggression from the United States. And, even in their actions today, you see how much they are still, pursuing a peaceful route. The DPRK blew up all of the inter railroads and roads so that there can't be aggression on land. They're still facing so much aggression from South Korea, which recently just sent drones into the North Korean airspace. They did, however, amend their constitution in light of, just decades of aggression from both South Korea and the U.S. And their attempts at diplomacy just failing or being sabotaged by the U.S. or South Korea. And now they have declared South Korea as a principal enemy. And I think this is interesting because for DPRK's, allies like China or Russia, for as long as DPRK is pursuing a peaceful reunification with the South and considering Korea as one, allies like China and Russia can't actually attack or respond to attacks from South Korea, because to them it is still one Korea and part of their allies. But with the North now calling the South a principal enemy, saying reunification or peaceful reunification does not seem possible, this relieves that blockage for countries like China and Russia to respond to any military attacks that might come from South Korea.
That's interesting, important, like something that people won't get really from the mainstream media. So thank you for that. I want to sort of think a little bit more about then the Russia-North Korean relationship and the China-North Korea relationship. I want to go back again, and just for people who may not know this history, in 2002, George W. Bush, at the State of the Union message, declared North Korea was part of the axis of evil. And at that moment, the whole world knew the U.S. was preparing to invade Iraq, which he said was also part of the axis of evil. So the North Koreans thought, okay, the U.S. is actually testing to see whether they can attack us too. And that was in the era of neocon supremacy. Like the Bush administration was off the charts, aggressive, super confident, filled with arrogance, like we're going to take over the world. It's the new era of unipolar power, blah, blah, blah. So they left the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as I said earlier, and they started building nuclear bombs. When they did, the UN went to the U.S. went to the UN Security Council and started to impose very severe sanctions on North Korea. Russia and China have a veto at the Security Council. They did not use their veto. They did not exercise the veto. In fact, they went along with the U.S., so they imposed sanctions on North Korea. Now, that's really something. China and North Korea fought together in the Korean War against the U.S. Russia, or before it, the Soviet Union, had longstanding good, excellent relations with North Korea. So this was a big change. And I think what was going on, well, there are two things, and I'll get your thoughts on it. One, Russia and China justified going along with the UN sanctions because they said otherwise the U.S. would unilaterally impose sanctions and it would be outside the context of the UN. And then they would have no say whatsoever, and that they were worried that the U.S. would then take this down the road and actually have a war with North Korea. But there's another element of it, which is I believe that Russia and China were both appeasing the U.S. at that time. I mean, to be blunt about it. I think their foreign policy, China's foreign policy and Russia's foreign policy was, we don't want to poke the bear. We don't want to make imperialism come against us. They have dominated Korea for a long time. We're going to go along. Now it's different. Now the U.S., after the pivot to Asia, has made it clear that China's a real enemy, an adversary. After the U.S. provoked the war in Ukraine and sanctioned Russia, Russia and China are in a confrontational mode with the United States, not because they chose it, but because the U.S. chose it. But now they have gone back, and you can see there's a warming, a real warming, a discernible warming, even beyond warming, of the relationship between China and DPRK and between Russia and the DPRK. Putin and Kim Jong-un met. They signed new security agreements. I mean, we are witnessing a dramatic shift in world politics. Again, it's the era of unipolar domination where China and Russia were afraid and on their back foot. Now there is this, what is popularly called the era of multipolarity. Very big impact on the Korean peninsula going forward. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts, your insights, and your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, things are not how they were before. As you're saying, there's this emerging multipolarity on the world stage. The US is really losing power economically, financially, politically. And so one of the last standing strategies for them is to divide East Asia into opposing military blocs that then grate against each other in Korea. And again, because the US military is stretched so thin across the globe, as you're saying, right now they're involved in the genocide in Palestine, they're funding the war in Ukraine. So they've really been pushing in the Pacific region for JACUS, or the agreement between South Korea and Japan and the US. Putin himself has argued that these joint military exercises between Japan, South Korea, and the US undermine peace and stability in that region. And it's from these hostile conditions that the DPRK and Russia signed their mutual defense treaty last June. They said that they'll pledge mutual aid to each other if either country faces aggression. But even if yes, that is a new stage in their partnership, but comparing it to the military agreement between South Korea and the US, where the US can fully take over South Korea's military and have operational wartime control over it, I mean, it just doesn't even compare. With the DPRK and Russia, they're saying we need this agreement to defend ourselves and we will help each other. But with the RK and the US is saying we control you so that we can start wars and make sure we have strategic control over that region to protect our interests. So I think even still, the US is still the aggressor here, and the opposing blocs in that region that are emerging are a result of the US. And one of the effects of the US attempts to sanction Russia and the DPRK, as well as its pursuit of this new military bloc in East Asia, has been to weaken the DPRK's isolation, because the US just can't enforce sanctions like it used to. The DPRK is reaping the benefits of that with increased trade that's actually allowing the DPRK to advance economically in key ways, especially with projects that are aimed at improving the quality of life for its people. And so, yeah, I think the US is really, I mean, like Yoon, as my mother said, is digging its own grave.
One of the most important things in terms of how the U.S. public perceives what's going on in Korea is the nonstop demonization of North Korea. Now, it's really
Mhm.
important. Like if I talk to people, including like liberals or progressive people, and I say anything good about North Korea, they kind of look at you like, "What? What are you talking about?" As a matter of fact, one time when I came back from DPRK, the last time actually, which was in 2013, it was the 60th anniversary of the signing of the armistice. And I talked to some people who lived in the same neighborhood, and they said, "Oh, what have you been up to?" And I said, "Well, I just came back from North Korea." And they said, "You mean South Korea?" And I was like, "No, North Korea." And they were like, "What?"
Mhm.
And they imagined that if you went to North Korea, you'd immediately be arrested, probably executed, like it's just a big, giant concentration camp. And, the North Koreans had a slogan that was like, seeing is believing. Let people come to North Korea and see for themselves. Like, and Americans say we're the freest people in the world, freest country in the world. But Jamie, in 2017, the US banned Americans from going to North Korea. As a matter of fact,
Mhm.
I was part of a group called Korea Peace Tours. We were sending delegations of people to North Korea so that they could see for themselves. What did they think? We weren't sending people who were from left or Marxist groups. It was like anybody who wanted to go. And
Yep.
then the US government said, no, you can't do that. And if you go, you're violating US law. Like you're living in the free world, and in the free world, you must stay. Uh, the irony of it is too much. But again, the demonization is complete, and people need to be able to go to North Korea or anywhere to see for themselves.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, the demonization was absolutely necessary for the US to be able to come out and argue, like, look how well South Korea is doing, capitalism works, and look how badly North Korea is doing because communism doesn't work. But, we have to remember that the Korean people in the North are either the people or the children of the people who were most militant fighters for independence and freedom, and anti-colonialism in Korea. Many people in the South, in fact, went up to the North to join the army in fighting for liberation in Korea. And so it's really, infantilizing to think that these people who were the most militant, who were the most organized and revolutionary, would just roll over, and just accept this, quote unquote, evil dictatorship. No, it is truly a socialist state that is defending its revolution to this day. And the entire society is involved in the development of the state. And Nodutdol also used to do delegation trips, to North Korea, and they have so many. Our members who've been have so many great stories. One that comes to my mind is just there being like no trash in the cities and how clean the streets were. And one of our members saw just a regular person like picking up the trash, on the sidewalk when they were doing tours in the city. And our member asked that person like, "Oh, like, are you, part of the are you a worker that is supposed to, pick up trash? Like, are you part of the sanitation team?" And that person looked at our member like really confused, like, "What do you mean? This is our land, this is our country. Like, of course I'm going to pick up the trash. Like, we should take care of our country because it's ours to, nurture and develop." Um, so yeah, we really view the travel ban as part of the larger series of sanctions, because it is in place to isolate the DPRK, to weaken the DPRK on the world stage, and really cut off their being any sort of like international support and solidarity with them. So part of our campaign, our U.S. out of Korea campaign, part of our demands is to lift all sanctions and end the travel ban, so that people can, like you're saying, go and see for themselves what the true reality is of the DPRK.
The North Koreans, the North Korean economy, the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, their economy was actually a larger economy than the South Korean economy until about 1970. And it was at that time that U.S. and Western and Japanese capital flowed in with the ruling elite families in South Korea. There was a definite move to build up the South Korean economy to say, look, capitalism works, and look, socialism doesn't work. Well, the first time I went to the DPRK was in 1989. So by that time, South Korea was a much bigger economy. But I can tell you that when I got there, this was before the collapse of the Soviet Union, when South Korea could still import, parts and equipment from other socialist countries in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, the economy looked like it was thriving. The people were confident. They were well fed. Children were walking down the streets in Pyongyang unaccompanied. The subway system was beautiful. The cities were very, very clean. I was like, oh, this is really different. When I went back in 2001, after the Soviet Union collapsed, after the severe sanctions, there was hunger. The caloric intake of the people, as the North Korean government said, was not really sustainable for human life. I mean, in other words, between drought and floods, and most importantly, sanctions and the loss of their main trade partners, the socialist governments, when it really became a unipolar power, North Korea went through a huge crisis. And it was terrible. And I saw it myself in 2001. But the last time I went, you could see 12 years later, I'm sure sanctions are still the dominant problem, but the economy had largely gotten back on its feet. People were going around doing things, going to restaurants, a lot of roller skating rinks being built and used in Pyongyang for recreation. I mean, it was really such a startling change. And that's why I think, it's so important for people in the United States to realize you don't have to be a fan of any foreign government. That's not my point. You don't have to be like in love with Kim Jong-un or North Korea or whatever. But see for yourself. You should be able to see for yourself what it's like, because the demonized version of that country is so false that you realize it's all a lie. And the lie is designed to prepare the American people to be endlessly either afraid or angry at the target of imperialism. That's what we learned from Iraq with Saddam Hussein, Libya with Gaddafi, now with North Korea, or endlessly with North Korea. The demonization has to be separated, has to be understood in the context of why the demonization is happening. It's to prepare us for war with them. And I think, Jamie, and I think this is one of the important things that Nodutdol is doing, your organization is doing, is by bringing the truth about what's going on in South Korea and U.S. relations or U.S. attacks on North Korea, you start to break down some of the demonization with facts, with information, with truth. And then you can have an actual dialogue with people outside of a demonized atmosphere where people can come to rational decisions. What would be the most rational decision from my point of view? And since we're moving to the finish line, I'm going to give you the last word. From my point of view, the most important thing would be to have a peace treaty with North Korea, end the sanctions on North Korea, live up to the point number 1 and 2 of the Singapore summit. I mean, the U.S. went to war with Vietnam, 3 million Vietnamese killed, 58,000 Americans died, and now the U.S. is, quote, at peace with Vietnam. Well, how did it turn out? I mean, we were manipulated. The people in the United States were manipulated, told that Vietnam must be your enemy. You must go fight and kill and die for against the Vietnamese Communist Party. But, oh, no, that's over now. If there was a peace treaty and a new atmosphere, as the Singapore summit promised, a new peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, everything would change. It would be great for people in South Korea. It would be great for people in North Korea. And it would diminish the idea that there could be another war in the Pacific, which could very easily become a global war. Anyway, with all of that, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, I want to return to the DPRK a little bit. And to say that, you're absolutely right in that they've always been working to provide a modern quality of life to its people, to the best of their ability. And despite, losing their number one trade partner after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the droughts and the floods, which had a huge impact in their production of food and just being able to power the country, now they're really being able to or have a opportunity to improve the lives of people and grow its economy. Based on their announcements, the DPRK's primary political goal right now is the 20 by 10 regional development plan, which is an economic initiative to improve the quality of life outside of Pyongyang, the capital. So what this looks like is the construction of modern housing, which is free for all workers,
Yep.
and building new hospitals, new cultural centers, that includes, new technology, and being able to continue education and, growing food production sites like fish farms and cutting edge agricultural cooperatives and factories to help diversify the economy of, the regions outside of the city. So, we're really looking forward to seeing how the DPRK grows in the coming years, and we hope to organize to lift the travel ban so, we can bring more people there and educate more, a broader base of people, and also lend our international solidarity with their efforts. And then in terms of, what we really hope to see on the Korean Peninsula, in addition to the peace treaty, which would no longer necessitate the presence of the U.S. On the peninsula, but as our campaign name emphasizes, we cannot move forward as the Korean people in independently and democratically determining our own future or what happens to our peninsula and our country for as long as the U.S. remains in South Korea. So, our main goal is for the U.S. to leave Korea, all of the military personnel, close down all of the military bases and return them to the Korean people, pay for all of the environmental damages. And this is the only way where, we can bring back a sense of stability in the region, in the country, and really allow the people, again, to not be in, fear and paranoia, but, start to, again, like work towards peaceful ways of reunifying and, building an independent democratic country.
All right, great. And Jamie, real quick before we go, if people want to go to Nodutdol's social media, find you, find the group, get involved, how do they do that?
Yes, we are on social media. It's Nodutdol on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. And we also have our campaign website, usoutofkorea.org. We're hosting rallies later today. It's December 4th, calling for the impeachment of Yoon, and we'll be posting any of our upcoming campaign activities and updates on our socials. So yeah, people can stay tuned and stay in touch.
All right, usoutofkorea.org is one site. We can see it up on the screen. Jamie, thank you so much.